Peter the Great's not-so-great fixation, the story of the first person charged with treason in the US, and, just in case you didn't already know, Columbus being a bad person. All that and more in this historical video. Story 2. I actually didn't know until recently, but the Corps of Discovery only ate meat and had incredible constipation. One day, they all ate pills they named Thunderclappers, which made them crap out everything immediately. But the pills had a little bit of metal in them, so if you go out on the same trail as the Corps of Discovery with a metal detector, you can find the exact place Lewis, Clark, and the rest of the Corps took the biggest craps of their lives. We now have a Discord. Check out the server in the link in the description. Story 4. In addition to all the other hijinks Columbus got up to, in later years he ran a sex slave business from the New World. He remarked in a letter to a friend that 9-year-old girls were a particularly hot item with the nobility of Europe. Story 5. Peter the Great scoured the Russian Empire in search of dwarfs and giants in an effort to breed a race of each. While he couldn't find enough giants, he found many dwarves. He would bake a huge pie and have a dwarf get naked and wait inside it to jump out and scare guests, in addition to using them as regular stewards and servants and such. That was the tip of Peter's crazy. Story 6. When Marie Antoinette was imprisoned by the French citizens, they took her kids. Then they had her oldest son assaulted by prostitutes so that he would contract their STIs. They then tried to use this as grounds to try her for abusing her children. The accusations went nowhere, so the poor kid was given a ton of venereal diseases for nothing. Story 7. The US had a eugenics program into the 70s that sterilized thousands of women, mostly black/poor. They would often do this under the guise of an emergency appendectomy post-birth. A woman gave birth to a baby after being assaulted and didn't know why she could never have children after. She was able to receive damages. Look up Buck v. Bell. Story 8. Johnny Appleseed didn't go around planting apple seeds just because. He sold the trees to settlers, and they used the apples to make booze. Tasty apples are a mutation, and apple trees used to make edible apples don't come from seeds, they come from grafting other tasty apple trees. Story 9. I'm posting the exact same thing every time this one comes up. Unit 731 and the Comfort Women/sex slaves. Excerpt from one of these women's diaries. You will be treated good if you dedicate yourself to the Emperor. I was forced to sleep with 10 to 15 soldiers every night. Then I got pregnant, but with that they removed my uterus and fetus because they thought I was still usable. On August 27th, a soldier with a sword asked, "Who can serve 100 soldiers?" 15 girls who didn't raise their hands were killed as an example to the rest of the girls. Soldiers took a naked woman by her head and feet and rolled her on a board with nails protruding out. Blood spurted and flesh dangled on the board. Soldiers boiled the dead girl's head and forced other girls to drink the soup. On December 1st, 1933, an officer killed a girl by stabbing a metal stick in her womb. On February 4th, one girl had a heated iron stick brutally shoved in her womb and died immediately just because she didn't notify to the officers that she had syphilis and eventually transferred it to one of them. After her death, there was burnt flesh left on the red heated iron stick. Soldiers covered girls' whole bodies with tattoos by intending to kill them in the first place. One Chinese man saw those girls being thrown away by Japanese soldiers. After they were gone, he rescued 2 girls who were barely alive and nursed them for 2 months. Story 10. I'm stealing this because it was so good. Apparently, during the writing of the Declaration, Ben Franklin would sneak off at lunch. Someone would always have to go fetch him, and they would always find him in the middle of a room surrounded by naked women. Story 11. The dresses and corsets worn by women in the court of Louis XIV were so cumbersome and difficult to get out of that women would often take a dump in the hallways of the Versailles Palace during grand balls. The morning after, the corners of the hallways in the palace would have piles of crap stacked up that the servants would have to clean up. Story 12. Every year was the pharaoh's solemn duty to go to the banks of the Nile, disrobe, and masturbate. A great many other men would follow him, and when the pharaoh was done, they too would bash one out on the banks. Further, it was believed that the pharaoh had to be sure that as much of his gentleman's relish as possible landed in the river itself rather than on the land in order to guarantee a good future harvest. Story 13. A college history professor I had told us that Martin Luther came up with the idea of salvation through faith alone when, while spending an entire day in prayer, he got a boner in church. He thought, well, F me. If I can sin while deep in meditative prayer, maybe no one can avoid sin, and the only thing saving us is our belief. I haven't been able to verify this on my own, however, so either I haven't found it yet or he was just BSing us. He was a very good professor otherwise, so I tend to believe him. Story 14. The story that caused me to get my degree in history. TLDR, Benedict Arnold's naked wife branded him the first man to commit treason against the colonies. Everyone know the name Benedict Arnold? No? Well, he is recognized as the first man to commit treason against the American colonies. They teach kids that he tried to turn over the fort at West Point in New York, in exchange for a knighthood or some such title. What people don't know is how the Colonial Army found out. Arnold's wife was a loyalist, or someone who agreed with the British and was not for the colonies to be free. She convinces her husband, who was in charge of the West Point, to talk to the British and see what they could do in order to gain political favor and power. Arnold and the British Navy, who were anchored nearby, came to the agreement that on a certain night, Arnold would leave a skeleton crew on guard at the fort, and Arnold would surrender it to the British. On the evening it was to happen, Washington and his troops had arrived on their way further north, asking Arnold if he could bunk his men for the night. Washington and his troops pitched their camp. That night, Washington couldn't sleep and decided to take a walk. On realizing that the fort was poorly guarded, he reinforced the fort with his own men. As the British attacked and were routed, Arnold escaped on horseback. Now, here's the reason I became a history major. What they don't teach you is that the Colonial Army found out about Arnold's betrayal because he left his wife behind. Arnold's wife lived in the barracks with him, and on discovering he had left her, she went mad. The Colonial Army discovered her running around the room stark naked and pulling her hair out. It wasn't until she knocked herself unconscious by running full force into a wall that they were able to apprehend her. She then told them the plan. That, my dear friends, is how Benedict Arnold was branded a traitor. Source. My source was from a history professor who taught his class like a biography. As an example, we learned about Benjamin Franklin not just through textbooks, but his lectures, which made things entertaining. Story 15. A. There was an American Nazi party prior to World War II that tried to stage a coup on the US government. B. Confessional booths were built by the church not for privacy, but to prevent priests from sleeping with young women and men. C. Catherine the Great had a secret sex salon full of furniture decorated with dongs, spread-eagled legs, and female mouths giving head, all tastefully embellished with a gold leaf. D. Gandhi conducted bizarre chastity experiments, during which young boys and girls bathed and slept with each other, but were punished for any sexual activity or talk. E. In Ireland during the Iron Age, the inauguration ceremony of a new leader involved the king-to-be publicly engaging in copulation with a white mare, which was eaten. Story 16. I got this one. So, most people know that the Romans wiped their butts with sponges on a stick. Most don't know they soaked said sponges in vinegar. We are all told about how when Jesus was dying on the cross, some Roman soldier gave Jesus sour wine on a sponge. Most people don't connect the two. Yes, the Roman soldiers had Jesus suck on a toilet sponge when he was dying of thirst and then laughed at him. Story 17. A. The Romans had an effective natural contraceptive. It was a plant called silphium, and the shape of the seed is where we get the traditional heart shape we all recognize as a symbol of love. Anyway, they banged so much that it went extinct. B. That millions more Chinese people had died at the cruelty of the hands of the Japanese than Jewish people died at the hands of the Germans. C. The diary of Anne Frank was edited by her father because of some of the things she talked about, such as her period, discovering herself, learning about her clitoris/labia, and learning some about boys from a younger guy that was staying with them too, and also her father's infatuation with fart jokes and such, which he didn't seem to want published. I can't seem to find the original article I read that went into much greater detail and showed some of what was edited out. D. Ben Franklin was a total man whore. E. During World War II, the propaganda aimed at dehumanizing the Japanese was so successful that American Marines in the Pacific were keeping the body parts of Japanese soldiers as souvenirs. We also accidentally dropped care packages behind enemy lines. They had gigantic condoms in them so that when the Japanese soldiers found something that was supposed to be for Americans, they would think that American men had huge dongs and it would make them feel inferior. F. The US tested nuclear bombs in Micronesia, causing hundreds of natives and their future children to be born with genetic defects. G. When the Russian Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government and stormed the Winter Palace in 1917, their revolution was halted for a few days. The reason was because the Bolsheviks got ridiculously drunk in the Winter Palace after finding the wine stores. And now, a quote. For sure, they don't teach you this in history class, but in colonial times, the person who got left in the stocks overnight was nothing less than fair game for everybody to nail, men or women. Anyone bent over had no way of knowing who was doing the ram job. And this was the real reason you never wanted to end up here, unless you had a family member or friend who'd stand with you the whole time, to protect you, to watch your ass. Story 18. Back in the day, pre-revolutionary times or so, one of the only things that women in the English colonies were allowed to have expertise on was the female body/reproductive system. Occasionally, a case would come up in court that required the inspection of a woman's body. Usually, it would be to determine if she had been assaulted or otherwise had sex out of wedlock. To handle these sorts of cases, the court would convene a jury of women from a nearby town to perform the inspection and report their findings. In one particular case, though, a married woman was petitioning for the annulment of her marriage on the basis that her husband was impotent. To test these claims, the court convened a jury of women tasked solely with attempting to bring the woman's husband to an erection. The article didn't mention the result of the case, but this remains one of the very few cases that a jury of women was convened in a court of law for any purposes besides their expertise in women's bodies. Story 19. In 1928, the United Fruit Company from Louisiana, had banana plantation in Colombia, and the workers organized a strike against them. They demanded written contracts, 8-hour workdays, 6-day work weeks, and the elimination of food coupons. The strike was one of the biggest strikes in Colombian history, and many communistic and liberal parties participated. U.S. officials in Colombia, along with United Fruit representatives, portrayed the workers' strike as communist, with subversive tendency. In telegrams to the U.S. Secretary of the Government, the United States of America threatened to invade with the U.S. Marine Corps if the Colombian government did not act to protect United Fruit's interests. An unknown number of workers died after the conservative government of Miguel Mendez sent the Colombian army to end the Union. An army regiment from Bogota was dispatched by the government to deal with the strikers, which it deemed to be subversive. Whether these troops were sent in at the behest of United Fruit Company clearly did not emerge. The troops set up their machine guns on the roofs of the low buildings at the corners of the main square, closed off the access streets, and after a 5-minute warning, opened fire into a dense Sunday crowd of workers and their wives and children who had gathered after Sunday Mass to wait for an anticipated address from the governor. General Cortez Vargas, who commanded the troops during the massacre, took responsibility for 47 casualties. In reality, the exact number of casualties has never been confirmed. Herrera Soto, co-author of a comprehensive and detailed study of the 1928 strike, has put together various estimates given by contemporaries and historians, ranging from 47 to as high as 2,000. Survivors, popular oral histories, and written documents give figures 800 to 3,000 killed, adding that the killers threw them into the sea. Story 20. Peter the Great had a thing for dwarfs. He would keep them around for entertainment, and if the mood struck him, he'd kill them in bizarre ways, such as putting a billow up their ass and pumping them full of air until they died. When he got married, he forced 2 dwarfs to get married in a ceremony that mirrored his own. He brought in dwarfs from all across Russia to be the guests, and then he and his friends laughed and made fun of them the entire time. During reception, they forced them to drink copious amounts of alcohol. Some of them even died from drinking. They made them do crazy stuff during the reception, and if my memory serves me correctly, the bride and groom had to consummate the marriage in front of Peter while he laughed and humiliated them. Story 21. Queen Victoria was a freak in the sheets. She reportedly lamented to her doctor that she would have no more fun in bed after he told her to quit having sex all the time if she didn't want more kids. Tsar Nicholas II's parents were vehemently opposed to him marrying Alex of Hesse, and to try and get him to stop pursuing her, they hired a ballerina to be his girlfriend/mistress, and sent him on a lad's tour of Japan. Didn't work, he married her. Everyone except for him hated her guts. Also, Madame du Pompadour likely had some issues that made sex painful and unpleasant for her. Maybe largely untreated STIs caught up with her, maybe it was just something wrong with the plumbing itself, we're not entirely sure. So she became BFFs with the Queen. She also made herself completely indispensable to the king, and handpicked his good time girls, so none of them would supplant her socially. Story 22. Most of Shakespeare's famous lines were dirty talk and sex slang. A rose by any other name was not a clever analogy to romantic love, but a direct reference to one of the employer's theaters, which were the modern equivalent of brothels, which itself was a slang for a woman's genitals, a triple entendre. A solid number of his poems were suggestive or directly referenced genitalia and sex acts. Really changes your perspective on his writing. High school got him so wrong. Story 23. Christopher Columbus kept a diary, and it is easily on par with some of the worst acts of ISIS. Assaults, murder, and torture were pretty common. One passage is about how he fed babies to dogs and made the mothers watch. Story 24. Part of the worship of Eros in New Testament times was the ability for men to go to the temple, pay a fee, and assault small boys. These were slave boys taken by force or sold to the temple by poor families who owed taxes or whatever. Not only was this not considered a crime, this was actually considered part of their worship of Eros. When St. Paul railed against homosexual offenders in the oft-cited scripture Christian homophobics use, he was actually condemning practices like this. You could buy little girls, too, at the temple, and pedos lined up all day long to indulge in all sorts of depravity. It was a huge industry that made temple owners rich. The early Christians were obviously disgusted by this sort of abuse and wrote very strong condemnations of it, which have fueled homophobic diatribes ever since. The word arsenokoitus in 1 Corinthians 6, 9-10 refers to a homosexual slave trader, and malakos refers to male prostitutes. It was translated as generally homosexuals, possibly out of puritanical censorship. No one wants to read about the rampant assaulting of kids in Sunday sermon. I'm not suggesting the Bible is okay with homosexuals. There are other scriptures that are much more specific about homosexuality. My personal opinion is that sexual orientation is not a choice. You are who you are, and you just have to be you. What I am saying is this one particular scripture is taken out of context. Assaulting little kids is wrong no matter your sexual orientation. Of course, 1 Corinthians 6:11 goes on to say there is forgiveness of even these most disgusting sins as long as you're truly remorseful and you have completely repented. I'd say sure thing, whatever, you're forgiven, just stay away from my kids. Story 25. The coastal village of Bottom in Aberdeenshire, Scotland was once the site of a massive shipwreck. The law stated that if all souls on a ship had perished, then the salvage rights to the ship and its cargo could be claimed. All the people were dead, but a monkey survived. To be sure they were following the law, the people of Bottom hanged the monkey and then took the stuff. I went to uni in Aberdeen, and there were some people in our year who was from this village. Apparently, people still ask Bottomers who hanged the monkey. There's a pub in Aberdeen called the Noose and Monkey named after the event.